and welcome to Book Lust. I'm Nancy Pearl. My guest today is Zayd Ayers Dohrn, whose book, Dangerous, Dirty, Violent, and Young, A Fugitive Family in the Revolutionary Underground, recently came out, and I am a huge fan of this book. I thought it was one of the best books I'd read in 2026, so I was so pleased when Zayd agreed to be on Book Lust with me. Welcome to the show, Zayd.
Thank you, Nancy. Thanks for having me.
As soon as I saw this book, I really wanted to read it, partly because I was at the University of Michigan with your father, Bill Ayers, and I came from a very lefty family. So it was kind of, reading this book was sort of like reliving my late teens into the, onward. I wanted to know, well, first of all, the title is so great, and it comes from a Jefferson Airplane song. But how did you, let's start there. How did you decide on the title?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. The Jefferson Airplane, first of all, played an interesting and funny role in my parents' lives as fugitives and in the Revolutionary Underground. For one thing, I discovered while I was writing and researching the book that Jefferson Airplane was one of the celebrity groups that actually donated money to the Underground. So they were literally helping to fund the groups that I'm writing about. So I thought that was kind of an interesting connection. But more importantly, that lyric, which is taken from a song called We Can Be Together, the full lyric is something like, we are all outlaws in the eyes of America. We are obscene, lawless, dangerous, dirty, violent, and young. And many members of the counterculture, including my parents, adopted that as kind of a personal slogan, the idea that we're all outlaws in the eyes of America, whether you're a woman or Black or an immigrant or queer, that made you an outlaw in the society they were fighting against. And so it was just kind of an interesting self-referential idea about who they were at that time.
When did you get the idea to write a biography, both a memoir, your own experiences, but also a biography of your parents' lives during this time?
Well, it's funny. I've been a writer professionally for about 15 or 18 years. And I never touched my family story. And it was one of those things where people who knew me as a writer would find out that I had this crazy background, that I had been born underground, that my mother was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. And they would say, how can you not have written that story? But the truth is, I think I resisted it for a long time. I mean, it's felt too messy and too complicated and too difficult to get into. But then a couple things happened. I think during the pandemic was really a turning point for me. My parents were getting older. My mother had just turned 80. And I mean, you remember what that was like. Anybody with sort of elderly relatives was feeling like, are we going to see each other again? And so it really made me think I should ask the questions I have about my parents' backgrounds while I still could. And of course, at the same time, we had Donald Trump and George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, all these things that seem to echo the things that my parents had been fighting against all those years ago. So it just felt like an interesting moment to explore that history.
What was the hardest part for you of doing that?
I guess like anybody who has written a memoir about their family, or anybody who just has had to have those difficult conversations with your family, there's things that go unspoken in a family. I mean, my family, I think there's a lot of love in my family between kids and parents, between siblings, but it's also, we came through some dark periods. And so it's always obviously a little bit difficult to have to sit down and take a deep breath and ask those hard questions, about, and in my case, my family history is literally a crime scene. It's an investigation of illegal activities. So that interview process definitely had some complicated facets. I would say that was probably the most difficult.
Yeah, I could see that those conversations would be fraught, which is a word I think it's a wonderful word, fraught. When you were doing the interviewing of your family, and of course, you talked to your parents, but you were the oldest of three brothers, and were their experiences noticeably or notably different from yours? Yeah.
It was one of the fun parts for me of writing the book. I'm quite close to my brothers, but you never there's very rarely a time to sit down and say let's go deep into our childhood memories and let's really think together about what we can remember and about how difficult those times were. So, I mean, for example, my middle brother Malik, I don't think we had ever talked about the time when my mother went to prison and what that was like for us growing up. And it's interesting because I'm the oldest. I have my memories of, I was like 6 or 7 when my mom was in jail. Malik was 3 years younger. He had a very different experience of that and a very different
Right.
experience of the aftermath of that. So yeah, I think that was an interesting aspect. And of course, my youngest brother Chesa is adopted, and he had a very different experience of that whole time. His parents went to prison for many decades, and we adopted him when he was just a baby. So trying to kind of think through together what it means for us now was one of the most illuminating and kind of rewarding parts of writing the book.
Were there things when I was reading the book, and I knew what was coming because it was like reading a history, and so I saw what was coming, and there were times in the book where I just wanted to say, don't do that, don't, stop, just don't go there. And did you have that kind of feeling?
Of course. I mean, it's funny. I'm a playwright mostly, and I teach dramatic writing, and we talk often about what they call dramatic irony, which is that feeling that you get from the Greek tragedies or Shakespearean dramas of, the outcome, Romeo and Juliet are going to die, Oedipus is going to discover this terrible thing, and you have that feeling of, why can't you stop? But of course, the inevitability of history, the inevitability of the story carries it forward. So I thought a lot about that. I mean, both as a writer in the terms of the craft of the book and how I wanted it to feel like a page turner, like you had to keep going even if you didn't want to.
Yeah.
And I also felt that way myself as a kid, kind of reliving those moments and thinking, oh, there's terrible tragedies coming. I wish people could rethink, or could redo those moments.
Yeah, certainly as a reader, it was totally a page turner, and yet at times, for me, I think every reader who's lived through the time that you're writing about, the time of your parents the family being underground, is going to have their own sort of trigger point. But the part that I found the most difficult to read was about the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, and the turn then that everything took. And my husband and I were planning to go there, but I was pregnant and we didn't go. And I think that I look back and think, well, it would have been something to have been there, but maybe it was for the best that we weren't there. So, So I think, was there a particular part of the journey that your parents were on that you found the most illuminating, that would explain them better to you or the period better to you?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I think of the book on on one level, if there's a big question driving the book or driving the investigation of the book, it's kind of what makes us who we are, and more specifically, what radicalizes somebody. What turned my mother from a relatively normal middle class white suburban kid who was, straight A student, first person in her family ever to go to college. How did she become a radical, a terrorist, a most wanted fugitive, all the thing, a kind of icon of the 1970s and violent resistance and revolution and all these things. And I mean, I went into the book honestly, like I know my mother extremely well, and yet it was very hard to reconcile the woman I knew with this idea of a kind of a Republican parents, middle class upbringing, and growing up in that 1950s world. So for me, a big part of the book was tracking how did that happen, especially for her, but also for all her friends and fellow travelers. I guess for me, one of the really illuminating things, partly because I was working on it during the time of George Floyd and the kind of racial reckoning over police violence and authoritarianism in the government and stuff. I would say you can really track my mother's radicalization very clearly along the lines of friends of hers and leaders who she respected being killed during that period. So she
Yeah.
started out, as an idealistic volunteer. She was a law student. At the University of Chicago. She volunteered for Dr. King's rent strike in Chicago, and she was just like any other progressive kid, wanting to make a difference, wanting to use her legal skills to make the world better. And then Dr. King was killed, and I think that sent her and a lot of other people into this sense of, he tried to do it the right way and they wouldn't let him. And then she joined SDS. She became a leader of SDS. She made an alliance with Fred Hampton, who was then the leader of the Illinois Black Panthers, a very young, charismatic, brilliant guy. And they were friends. She joined his Rainbow Coalition of activist groups. And then he was murdered by the Chicago police in cold blood. And I think just for her and a lot of people, there were these moments of just thinking, we're trying to do this the right way. And then the government comes along or the white vigilantes come along and kill the people who are trying to make things better. And I think that really sent her on this road into a much more violent form of resistance.
Yeah. So I think that begs the question of why do you think, because you're around college students and that whole generation, why is nothing like SDS happening now?
It's a good question. I think about this a lot. And I mean, I guess my answer is twofold. One is I think there are things that are happening that are a little bit like SDS now. And they might be, in retrospect, we might look back and say, there were these big movements growing, the environmental movement, the Black Lives Matter
Right.
movement, the Parkland kids and the anti-gun violence movement. And even the kind of democratic socialists who are now electing officials all over the country. I think you see youth activism um, in various ways. It's a little bit more fragmented probably than it was then, just like all of our media and culture and everything else is fragmented. But I do think there's a lot of activism and idealism among the young. I guess one of the things that worries me, and it goes to your point about the SDS convention in 1969, is one of the things I was struck by doing the research for this book is that my mother and her friends spent the entire 1960s protesting peacefully for change and doing democratic, voter registration drives and trying to elect better candidates and sit-ins and die-ins and be-ins and all the other things that you read about in the 1960s civil rights movement and anti-war movement. And it was really only after 9 or 10 years of doing that and seeing nothing change, seeing things seem to get worse, Nixon reelected, the Vietnam War escalating, and that was really what turned her and many of her friends towards this like despairing, nihilistic kind of, we have to do more, we have to destroy this war machine and this racism machine that we're opposing. So anyway, I guess I would just say I worry that here we are 10 years into the various Trump administrations and 10 years into a lot of progressive resistance, idealism. And I wonder what happens after 10 years of young people doing everything they could think of and feeling like it's not working.
Right. Just getting this sense of hopelessness about the way the, climate and everything that you talked about. I wonder, were there books? You talked to a lot of people in the writing of this book, and but were there people besides your parents who you felt exemplified that period, that helped you understand it better?
Do you mean like people who lived in that period or people who wrote about that period?
Both. Both.
Yeah, I mean, there were a bunch. Of course, I read every book I could get my hands on about the period, both written firsthand accounts of the period,
Right.
of which there are many. My dad has written 2 memoirs of his own, so of course I've read those. I guess of those books, one of the ones that really blew my mind and kind of was very helpful for me was Asada Shakur's autobiography. I was surprised both at what a good writer she is and at what an incredible life she led, and how, and of course, one of the big surprises in the book, in my book, for me and hopefully for the reader, is the strange ways that the Black underground and Asada Shakur specifically were entangled in my family's history.
Right.
So I guess that I would say a Sada Shakur autobiography is quite an interesting read. And then there are many books. Sale wrote a book called SDS, which is like a comprehensive history of Students for a Democratic uh, Society, and I found that book really useful. There's been, many books written about the Weather Underground specifically, or about the Black Panther Party. Jamal Joseph's book, Panther Baby, was really useful for me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I mean, I think for me, what they all lacked, I guess, in some way was, well, I guess I would say there were the insiders from that period who wrote those, who wrote at the time about their own experience. And of course, they're so close to the experience that they rarely have a global view of it.
Yeah.
And then there are the
Right.
historians who came along afterwards, some of whom did a fairly good job, but none of them had the access or the insider knowledge of that movement. So what I hoped I could bring was both a kind of journalistic historian sensibility to
Right.
show a comprehensive history, and also the access to those people to like really get us inside their heads.
Right. And I think from this reader's, my viewpoint, you did totally. I thought it was just great. There were two books that I was thinking of when I was reading the book, and one is a novel and the other is a memoir. But the memoir is How I Became Hetty Jones, by Leroy Jones' ex-wife, which was just really just a very, sometimes memoirs I find get just so defensive or poor me or whatever, especially somebody who's caught up in a movement like the Black Panthers, like she was in the Black Panther movement. And the other one is a novel by Marge Piercy called Vida, V-I-D-A. I don't know if you, I really think that it's about a young woman, not unlike your mother, who goes underground, and those experiences. And it was written, I believe it was published in the 70s.
Oh, that's interesting.
I would recommend. Yeah, I'd recommend.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I read, Dennis Piata has a book called Eat the Document, which is about a novel, but kind of about a underground figure. Yeah, so there are many interesting treatments. Of course, in media, we have everything from Running on Empty all the way through One Battle After Another. So it's been a source of a lot of interesting cultural documents. Yeah.
Right. Were there things that your parents just absolutely didn't want to talk about?
In particular, my mother, who is a very private, reserved person. I think if it hadn't been for the fact that I'm her son and that she had a sense that I had a right to tell my version of the story, I think for me that was, there were things she felt uncomfortable about, but that she was willing to talk about. And then there were things that we had a rule when we started the process of the interview, which is that they couldn't lie to me, but that if there were things that touched on sensitive subjects, especially sensitive legal subjects, that they could just say that's something I don't want to talk about or I can't talk about. But I think honestly, in 3 years of interviewing them, I think they only availed themselves of that privilege maybe once or twice. I think they felt like usually the only reason they would have made that decision, I think, the once or twice that they decided they couldn't talk about something, it was usually because they thought it might implicate one of their former friends in a criminal situation. And so there's still a very strong code of like we don't rat on our friends, obviously. But other than that, they were very forthcoming with me.
Are there things now at this point? Are you done with the book? Do you know what I mean? Or are there still things that you think, oh, darn, I should have, talked about that more? Or...
I mean, I feel pretty good about, like, it has been a long process and a lot of kind of thinking about it. And of course, as I said, I mean, I spent 15 or 20 years as a writer not writing about it, but that
Right.
time accrues into a lot of, it's like, I think if I'd written this book in my 20s, I might have missed a lot that I wanted to talk about. But I feel like by waiting, I was able to have a good idea beforehand of the things I really wanted to make sure I could get to.
Plus, in your 20s, you didn't have the outside situation of the way the culture is now and what's happening here now to set this against, not, I mean, against in the sense that that's the backdrop, and the book is talking about the way it was then compared to making the reader think, well, what's it like now, and why are certain things happening? Just one more quick question, because our time's almost up. The whole turn in the revolutionary movement in the United States toward what I always think of as like the Cultural Revolution, and this attacks on the people in it, the leaders, looking at yourself, self-criticism, all of that. Do you think that was inevitable? Do you think that's inevitable in every revolutionary movement? I know that's a really big question.
No, I've thought about it a lot. I mean, I do think for sure this sense of, well, I'll start by saying that my parents became very emblematic of a certain kind of factionalism in the progressive movement. Of course, my mother splitting SDS to form Weathermen was one of the signal moments of that kind of breaking apart of these mass movement groups. But I mean, I guess when you look more broadly, you see, even at the time, all of those groups were splitting into factions. So the Black Panther Party, which was one of the biggest and most important mass movements in the country, also split in half in East Coast and West Coast, and there was feuds and attacks and factional disputes. And then, of course, I think, as you're implying, Nancy, if you look at history, progressive and revolutionary movements have a tendency to fracture in these ways, all the way back to the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, and probably long before that.
Right.
So do I think it's inevitable? I think it's an Achilles heel of the left and is always a danger for radical progressive movements. And I think it's something you see today in radical movements. You see the kind of purity tests and cancel culture, or whatever you want to call it, that there is a sense of when people are ideologically committed to something, they can be very intolerant of dissent, and they lose sight of the fact that they need allies and they need a broad coalition. Right. So do I think it's inevitable? I think it crops up regularly enough that we can say it's a part of human nature. But I also think it's a part of human nature that we can try to resist and we can try to do better. And the movements that have done better, everything from Cuba to Algeria to South Africa, have managed to keep their factional disputes to a minimum and build a movement that actually can endure.
Well, Zayd, thank you so much for spending this time talking about your really terrific book, Dangerous, Dirty, Violent and Young, A Fugitive Family in the Revolutionary Underground. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. It's been a great conversation.